All right, so what I've got in front of us now is what many of us will recognize as a typical five-line staff. If you're used to reading music, then you see this all the time. If you're not as familiar with it, this may be something you've had introduced to you maybe as early as elementary school. But in any event, what the five-line staff does is it gives us 5 lines. And of course, those lines encompass 4 spaces. And this is usually kind of the canvas or the framework, so to speak, of where our notes will be written down, right? So before we get much farther, I'd like you to try something for me. I'm going to write a note on the staff here, and I'd like you to take just a second to identify it. So go ahead and see if you can come up with a name for this note. All right, so a few of us may have had a couple of question marks happening as we tried that exercise, and for very, very good reason, as I hope you'll find as we unfold kind of the instruction here. This note, as it's written, I can't come up with a name for it. It doesn't really have a name. It's kind of meaningless in terms of naming the actual note. And that's because it's missing a piece in terms of the notation that orients us or that gives us a sense of kind of what range of notes we're looking at. And that piece of notation is referred to as the clef, right? So maybe those of you who are used to this, maybe you're used to reading treble clef. And your first inclination was to look at this note and say, oh, well, that must be a B. Right? Others of us might be more used to reading bass clef, at which point you look at that and say, well, that's a D, right? And perhaps there's a few violists in the room, so to speak, where we look at this and we say, well, actually, folks, that's the note C. Well, depending on the clef, any of those could be right, any of those could be wrong, but it kind of gets us prepared, it kind of puts us in a framework to understand what clefs actually do. So let's go ahead and transition to what I call the never-ending staff, or it's going to look quite different. Check this out. Okay, so if you're used to reading notation on the 5-line staff, this looks really kind of bizarre. I mean, what are all these lines doing here? Who reads this? Well, the answer to that question, who reads this? No one, really. But it's a way of kind of illustrating what clefs are and what clefs actually do. What I want you to do is I want you to check this out. You'll notice I've got a series of 11 lines here. Theoretically, I could have written a lot more. I could keep going lines above, lines below, and really that's to illustrate the fact that in terms of staff lines, when we're looking at staff lines, we're looking at 5, but we're really looking at a particular subset of 5 from what's really kind of an infinite succession of these lines could go on forever. I want you to notice the line I have in the middle here, okay? That's really important. In fact, I'm going to call this one middle C. And this is a really kind of a bit of a touchstone here because we're going to use this to help us understand how all the different clefs work. So after drawing middle C, I'm going to go ahead and start drawing some clefs here. All right, so now I have a few clefs that are written here, a few symbols that will look familiar, at least a couple of these may look familiar to you, and I want to kind of show you how this works. So as I've said, this line here, this red line, I'm going to call that middle C, and we're going to see how all the different, see what I did? Okay, this is too fun. We're going to take a look at what all of these clefs do in relationship to that red line, in relationship to that middle C. This top clef here you may recognize as the treble clef. Right? But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it the G clef. All right? So we're going to call that the G clef. This middle one here, this is, you know what? I'm just going to call it the C clef. And there's a reason I didn't give it another name just yet, which we'll talk about. And then finally, this one, we will recognize this in many cases as the bass clef. But I'm going to call it for now the F clef. Here's why. Everything has to do with that center line, that middle C that we're talking about. I want you to notice the shape of this middle clef. We'll look at that one first. This thing here, which I'm calling the C clef, I want you to notice how these kind of brackets, these rounded brackets, they really center right on this red line that we talked about. Well, remember, where this red line tells us where middle C is. And by the way, on the piano, middle C is roughly in the middle of the keyboard. We sometimes call it C4, right? So this is kind of where that's located. And I want you to notice how this clef here purposely centers itself on middle C. All right, so hold on. I didn't give it a name before. I just called it the C clef. Well, so what do we call it? Here's where we kind of start to talk about these lines a little bit. If I am zoomed in to where I am looking at middle C as well as the 2 staff lines above and below it, in this instance, we're going to call this the alto clef. right? And the alto clef, it's used by viola players as far as the standard orchestral instruments go. It's used by viola players pretty much all the time. Sometimes they'll wander in the treble clef, but that's kind of their main clef, right? Now, but sometimes my perspective changes. Maybe instead of looking at these 5 lines here, I'm going to get rid of that top line that I've got in my little box here, and I'm going to instead pick up one more line below. Now that I've got these 5 lines here in the middle, right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, now I'm going to call that the tenor clef, right? And the tenor clef is used by a few orchestral instruments that typically read bass clef. Examples of that include the bassoon, the trombone, the cello, and that's when they start to get to notes that are a little too high to fit comfortably within the bass clef. Sometimes they'll swap it out for the tenor clef. But I want you to notice what I did. I did not change the location of any of the notes. I did not move the clef, so to speak. What I changed was my perspective. With the alto clef, my perspective had me looking at these 5 lines here, whereas with the tenor clef, I shifted that perspective down just a little bit to where now I'm looking at these 5 lines, okay? So that's why I called it the C clef before, because depending on your perspective, it may serve as the alto clef or the tenor clef. Now, if you really want to go crazy with the C clef, there's also mezzo-soprano clef, there's soprano clef, there's baritone clef, and all of those are just representations of moving your perspective up or down on like kind of this infinite series of lines here. Now, we'll go to this clef here, on the right end here, and this is the bass clef, and I want you to notice what's happening here. Remember I called it the F clef. What I've done is when I'm looking at it on the staff, I'm looking at these 5 lines here within this box. Notice how all of these lines are below our reference point of middle C here, okay? So the bass clef shows us the 5 staff lines directly below the location of middle C. Again, these 5 here, okay? And so why do I call it the F clef? Well, take a look at these dots right here, okay? If I start from C, and this kind of gives us an indication, by the way, of how the musical alphabet works, right? We're going to go down gradually, and we'll alternate from lines to spaces, lines to spaces. So if I go from C, when I go down, I'm going to go backwards in the alphabet. So if this line is C, this space is B. If this space is B, this line is A. Okay, and now I'm at the beginning of the alphabet. What do? Well, I just recycle the 7 letters that I use in the musical alphabet. So one below A is going to be G. All right, and then one below G, this space to this line is going to be F. Check this out, F. And notice how these dots center on this line right here. The purpose of the bass clef is to use the 5 lines below middle C, and we know our orientation is based on these dots, right, that surround F below middle C, which is why we call it F clef. And by the way, not only do you have these dots, you also have kind of this bolder point here at the end of the clef as well. Both of those are intended to show us F below middle C, which is why, again, we call it the F clef, okay? And now going back to the first clef I drew here, the treble clef. Remember how the bass showed us the 5 lines below middle C? Well, now the treble clef is going to show us the 5 lines above middle C, right? So again, C is right here, but we're going to grab these 5 lines to show the typical within staff range for the treble clef, okay? And it's called the G clef. Well, you may be catching on now. Just as the bass clef showed us, denoted F below middle C, the treble clef is going to show us G above middle C. Well, how's it going to do that? Because it's got this weird little loop down here, it's got this other little loop-de-loop up here, and then all this stuff in the middle. It's the little thing right here. That's what we're concerned about. The little swirl kind of at the base of like the body of the clef, not counting the tail, right? So this swirl right here, notice how it surrounds this line, okay? And if we do our alphabet counting this time from middle C upwards, well, okay, fine. If this is C on this line, then the space will be D. The line above that is E. The space above that is F. Remember, we're going in alphabetical order now because now we're going up, okay? So just one above F is G. And sure enough, we have our little swirl, okay, at kind of the bottom of the treble clef that shows us G above middle C. So those are the 3 main clefs that we talk about. But again, I want us to get the idea that all of these clefs are just helping us orient where we are on this theoretically endless succession of lines. And that's important because there are a few misconceptions out there around how clefs work, especially when you're going between clefs, going from maybe a treble clef to reading alto clef. There's a misconception that the clefs are somehow moving, that the clefs are being changed and relocated, or the notes are somehow moving. The notes aren't going anywhere, right? The notes are staying right where they are. It's just our perspective that changes as we move among the clefs.